Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to what is now the final weekend of Delaware Shakespeare's mostly virtual festival. Today's program is called The Tempest and Restorative Justice, and I'm very grateful to be joined today by Barbie Fischer from the Delaware Center for Justice and Saad M. Soliman from Peers Mentoring Center. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Great to be here.
So for folks who are watching today, if you are familiar, or if you aren't familiar with the concept of restorative justice, we hope that today's discussion will really be an introduction to what's a very important topic. And if you are familiar with the concept of restorative justice, we hope that the connection to the Tempest and how we'll be talking about that today maybe provides a different lens to look at this topic from. If you've been watching these events, you know that the point of this mostly virtual festival is that because we can't be with you this summer at Rockwood Park, giving you a performance of The Tempest, we're trying to celebrate all the things that you love about seeing Shakespeare under the stars. And one of those things is relevance to contemporary life. And we hope that today's conversation really connects to that aspect of what you love about the summer festival. We'd like to thank Jansen's Market for being the lead sponsor of the Mostly Virtual Festival and our honorary producer, Laurel A. Regal. We also need to thank the Delaware Division of the Arts for its year-round support. And some COVID-19 emergency funding that we have received from the National Endowment for the Arts, Delaware Humanities, and Delaware Community Foundation. So to the topic of restorative justice. So some people might be like, why are you doing a discussion on the Tempest and restorative justice? And actually, before COVID-19 brought everything to a halt this spring, Delaware Shakespeare was planning to do an entire series of events in the spring exploring the Tempest and restorative justice. And for me, the reason is that the central question of the Tempest, I think, is what do you do when someone does you wrong? And what do you do when you've done wrong to someone else? On both sides of that question, how do we best move forward? And from just the very beginning of what I'm learning about restorative justice, that concept of how do you best move forward as an individual and as a society seems to be a core principle of restorative justice. We know this conversation is really just going to scratch the surface of the topic. In emailing with Barbie earlier, she mentioned that she's done entire podcasts on just one of the questions that we're going to try to wrestle with today. But we have Shakespearean ambitions, so we're going to see how much ground we can cover today. So just very briefly, I want to introduce Barbie and Saad. Barbie Fischer is the program coordinator for the Victim Restoration and Community Mediation program at Delaware Center for Justice. And she's also the executive director of Restorative Encounters, a nonprofit that engages in training processes for restorative justice. She's been a restorative justice practitioner for almost 20 years, working both in the US and internationally. Saad M. Soliman is the founding executive director of Peers Mentoring Center, a comprehensive reentry program run by Piece, which specializes in working with men and women transitioning home after serving a term of incarceration. And he's also been doing this work for 2 decades. So we have a lot of experience and expertise with us in the Zoom room today. So again, I'm very grateful for both of you to take the time to be with us and discuss this and share your knowledge with us today. So I think, Barbie, I'd like to start with you and just ask you if you can give us kind of a working definition of restorative justice for someone who might not be familiar with that topic.
Sure. So restorative justice, I like to call it the white Western term. It is really based on values and principles from our Indigenous ancestors from around the globe that focuses on how do we live life together. So it's really not just about when harm happens, but it's really about, in general, how do we live in community with one another where all of our needs can be met and we can all thrive. So a lot of folks say that restorative justice is an Indigenous way of dealing with hurt and harm, which that it is, but it really goes beyond that into a whole worldview based on values like respect, dignity, that people should have a say in how they go about solving their problems and getting their needs met. And at the core, again, it is that we all have needs, and when our needs aren't met, that creates conflict. And so what do we do when that conflict arises and that harm happens? So we like to think of it as a dichotomy between the criminal legal system and restorative justice. The criminal legal system tends to ask us, what happened, who did it, what do they deserve? Whereas in the restorative justice lens, we talk about who's been harmed, what are their needs, and who's obligated to meet those needs, which allows us to go beyond what we often think of as just the direct victim in a crime, and also look at maybe the offender or the person who has caused harm has also needs that were not met or has also been harmed, which led to this crime in the first place. So it allows for a much more holistic view of what's happened and the parties involved.
Great. Thanks, Barbie. So Saad, can I ask you if you want to tell us a little bit about your work at Peers Mentoring Center, and then how that work coincides with this concept of restorative justice?
Absolutely, David. Thank you. Barbie, that definition I think was phenomenal. It really is. So to explain it in a simple moment, restorative justice is sort of a macro term. On a micro level, we're talking about equality. We're talking about justice. We're talking about the equanimity in societal movements where everyone is allowed the opportunity to pursue their dreams without barrier. Now we know systemic barriers exist, societal barriers exist, social barriers exist, economic barriers exist. Social justice encompasses that entire space, and getting down into the minutia, it's more the scalpel than it is the hammer. At Piece by Piece, and Peers Mentoring Center is our foremost reentry program. It leads all of our directly impacted citizens through the transition period of their returning. We focus a lot and very heavily, not only on restorative justice as a macro term, but the concept rooted behind it in a recovery term. So the terms of perpetrator and victim, we prefer to use humanizing language in those terms of responsible party, harmed party. And that language, just that simple humanizing language, begins to add the onus of responsibility on those that are responsible and allows the concept of causing harm to really begin to develop in the socio-normative culture lens that we're promoting. As people are transitioning, that lens expansion allows thinking to be more empathic and more generous and kind. That we've found has been the missing ingredient in reentry programming traditionally, because we productize systems so that we can maximize efficiency, maximize capacity. But what we don't do as a system is incorporate those human components that actually further healing.
Great. So Barbie, can you tell us a little bit about the victim restoration and community mediation program that you run at Delaware Center for Justice?
Sure. Most people more commonly know it as the victim offender mediation or victim offender conferencing program, which of course, like Saad said, that language is very polarizing and not really humanizing at all. As well as we often find that when harm and hurt occurs, there can be responsibility on both sides. So you don't necessarily have a clear victim or a clear offender. And so we're really here at the Delaware Center for Justice trying to shift away from that language, along with our society as a whole, trying to help them shift away from that language. So we deal with victims who are people who are named victims in court cases, and those who are labeled as offenders or defendants in court cases. And the Court of Common Pleas and Family Court here in Delaware refers cases to us pre-trial to see if the two parties would be willing to have a conversation, to talk about what happened, how they've both been impacted, and what's needed to ensure that this doesn't happen again, and that the harm that happened is solved or resolved in some way, shape, or form. So that can mean apologies, it can mean restitution payments, which is really the fancy term for financial compensation because of damage that happened. So if my car was destroyed because someone was angry with me, I would be looking to get that financial reimbursement in order to repair my car. So that's what we call that's the restitution, the fancy word for that. So we really work at discovering what are the needs of all of these parties, not just the victims themselves or the people who have been harmed, but also those who have caused the harm or the responsible party, as Saad said, what are their needs as well? Because we find that crime happens when needs aren't met. And that can mean basic needs of feeling respected. It can mean mental health needs. It can mean needs that go to just making sure that I have money in my account and can afford food. It is a whole host of reasons that we see that people commit crime that really probably shouldn't wind up with a criminal record. And so our job here is really to just talk to the parties, see if they're willing to dialogue with one another and see what those needs are and how we can help them meet those needs.
Great. All right, so jumping into the Tempest. So in the Tempest, the main character is Prospero, and he's been done a very severe wrong. He has been deposed as Duke by his brother and a king from a neighboring kingdom, and then banished to a desert island. And his daughter was 3 years old when this happens, so they've been on this desert island for 12 years. And he has never really told the truth of what happened to him to his daughter. And at the very beginning of the play, he finally does share the truth of what happened to him. So I guess my first question is, are there victims who for whatever reason, aren't able to share the full truth of what it is that happens to them? And is there a restorative justice impact of when they are able to share the full truth of what happened? I guess maybe we can start with Barbie, unless Saad, I can see you ready to jump in there, but whoever wants to jump in there.
Barbie, I will defer out of respect, but I'll tell you, I have an answer for that one.
You seem quick to the draw, so go for it.
So the thing about it is that there's so much shame with being a victim. Our society has, not just our society, but our globe has literally associated such a shame with being victim. And the sensitivity to that is just now coming to the fore. I mean, we have a variety of movements, social movements, the Me Too movement, the LGBTQ movement, to just simply identify that we no longer need to live in shame. Well, as a victim of crime, there's so much trauma associated with that term victim that you associate with it brokenness. You associate with it a lack of adjustment in society, an inability to cope. You're not strong, you're not capable. All of these messages are interwoven into that word victim. And so the shame associated with the fear of exposing that I am a victim indeed, and the shame associated with it is paralyzing and can be. Indeed, most people that have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system, have you ever heard the term hurt people, have been victims themselves of similar crimes to which they perpetuate.
Right. Yeah, and the actor who's playing Prospero, we've been already discussing this question, and that very question of shame has come up, that that perhaps he's ashamed that he allowed this to happen to him, that that when he was a Duke, he wasn't the most attentive Duke. He kind of lost himself in his studies and really wasn't being a proactive ruler. And so is he ashamed that, wow, he allowed this to happen and allowed him and his daughter to be banished in this way?
It's a forfeiture of control.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that's the thing with Prospero. I think shame is a huge one with Prospero. I think for victims, there's numerous reasons and why they might not be able to fully disclose what happened. And that goes even into the neuroscience of what happens to us, to our brains when we are traumatized or experience something traumatic. I mean, you have to think that we believe as humans that the world functions in a certain way. And we believe as humans that crime is never going to happen to us. Severe harm isn't, we know, you know, theoretically, yeah, I could be hurt, but we don't embody that as like walking out of our doors and thinking, oh, I'm going to get mugged today. Like, if we lived that way, we would live in fear and it would be no way to live whatsoever. So when a crime happens or when a harm happens to an individual, their entire world gets flipped upside down. So you have to think, every day I've walked outside of my house and I felt fine and I felt comfortable. And now all of a sudden something's happened where I don't feel fine. I don't feel comfortable. And so in regards, I would say shame is an aspect of that, but also there's this powerlessness. Something happened to me that I couldn't stop. And if shame isn't a part of that, the powerlessness is. That I have no power to do what I needed to protect myself or to protect my property or to protect those that I love. And so there is this sense of powerlessness also that keeps us from fully telling what has happened or what has occurred to us. And then there is the real aspect of our brains completely shut down that verbal center when we experience trauma. And that's what the neuroscience shows us. And so we can't always expect victims to say, this is what happened to me, because their brain isn't able to connect the part of that has experienced it with the verbal center. As well as when you ask people to talk about something that's been traumatizing to them, often they're reliving that as they're telling it. And so that's a huge thing that people need to remember. When you're asking someone about a very difficult situation in their life, you're really asking them to put back on their hat from that moment and relive that. And that can be overwhelming to the point where it's re-traumatizing. So that's another reason why folks don't often tell the full story. And it's not necessarily that they're not being truthful or that they're not saying the truth. It's just that they're unable to mentally be able to say that because of how the brain works, or because of other things that are going on with them, feelings of that powerlessness or that shame. And so, and truth is a tricky thing. That word truth is a tricky thing. There's, you know, we talk about with communication, 95% of all communication is how it's received. So I might intend for you all to receive the message that I'm giving to you, but I have no control over whether or not you're receiving it in that manner. That's all up to you and what your experience has been. And so that's another part with truth is we can have two people that have experienced the same exact situation together, and they view it completely differently because they're viewing it from these different lenses. And that's part of what restorative justice is finding those gaps in those stories and figuring out how to bridge those gaps so that we can see from each other's perspective.
You said something that's going to be very helpful to the actor playing Prospero. We talked about that retelling that truth can have a re-traumatizing experience. For an actor, one of the challenges of Prospero's first scene is it's 20 pages of literally just telling what's happened to you in the past. And for an actor, actors hate doing that. Actors hate telling exposition, but it's not just telling something, it's reliving it.
There's actually a great, for all you theater buffs out there, being that we're talking about Shakespeare today, there's a really great modality that we use called playback theater that we often use as a great restorative justice tool that folks do, where people can't exactly express themselves. And so they're able to relay a bit of information to a group of actors who then without words reenact that or act that out for people to then be able to get a sense and a feeling to it. And it can be very therapeutic for those who have been harmed, and it allows for those around them to have a better sense of what they've been going through. So it's been great to also build that community support. So playback theater is amazing and used in many different ways all around the world.
So Saad, you started talking about people who have been harmed frequently then will harm themselves, or not harm themselves, but enact harm on others. And we definitely see that in the Tempest. So Prospero has been done this wrong, but then once he arrives on this island, he very quickly does wrong to the two other beings on this island, and he, basically forcibly enslaves two, in this case, because it's Shakespeare, slightly magical beings, Ariel and Caliban, and forces them to serve him for a kind of unknown length of time. So I just want, if you wanted to talk more about that cyclical nature of harm being done to someone and then it perhaps perpetuates.
So it's as Barbie mentioned, the forfeiture of control, the admitting of powerlessness. This happened to me. You couple that with the trauma, the unresolved trauma, and the bitterness of being a victim. That, when gone unaddressed, will literally seep into behavioral patterns that come out permutated as crime or harm to others. Because if your perception of the world is that we should all be fair, we should all be just, we should all be kind, and something unfair, unjust, unkind caused you so much pain, your perception can be permanently altered. And the data suggests that trauma alters the lens. It alters our perception. And so those being victimized, often cases, begin to perceive that behavior towards others differently than those who have not. Such that when you find individuals that have been both harmed and responsible, you see this incredible amount of remorse when faced with the realities of what they have been involved in. That incredible remorse, it can go both ways. It can debilitate you or it can empower you. It can empower you to be an advocate, a mentor, someone that sponsors someone else. We see that in the recovery community very frequently. We see that in men and women that are transitioning from the incarceration community frequently. People wanting to give back because the victim, the harmed party that they are unable to reach, they want to reach by proxy through general good nature. And giving back to someone who's in front of them, the pay it forward concept. Juxtapose that against bitterness of that unresolved trauma, and you find in it the emotional damage that takes place when harm is caused to someone. And it comes out in ways that are interpreted without the background information. And that interpretation can be, it's a crime, it's anti-authoritative, it's anti-social, it's. And we as a society, we as a nation, we have to label something. We have to put a term to it so that we can normalize it. Going back to what Barbie was talking about in terms of our norms, our belief system. What is truth? It's certainly subjective rather than objective, because it's relative to each individual's perception and the vantage point in which they sit.
Yeah, there's these two cycles that we see, which is the victims, they often call it the victim cycle or the trauma experience, where you're acting inwards. So often when harm has happened to us, we can cause damage to ourselves or start acting inwards of trying to make meaning out of this, trying to understand, how does this fit into my worldview? How does this fit into my view of what normal life should be? And so we start acting inwards, and that we see that manifesting in destructive behaviors like alcoholism, drug addiction, all of those things, as well as, there's a lot of times where I see a lot of young girls who are sexually assaulted or sexually abused who wind up being very promiscuous. And people are dismissive of that behavior and use it against them, when in reality, that's a way for them to be making meaning. That is a way for them to be acting out this trauma cycle. And then you can often, that trauma cycle easily moves into what we call an aggressor cycle, where we're acting outwards. So that same trying to make meaning we wind up doing to others what might have been done to us, or we just are acting aggressively towards those around us because we're not sure how to make meaning of this. The world, again, is upside down. It doesn't make sense to us. So that's where we see a lot of times those who have been harmed can cause harm to those most close to them, to their loved ones and their family members. They might have short tempers or short fuses. They might not even understand themselves why they're acting this way. So that's the aggressor cycle. And what we see, there's two kind of main points of trying to break this cycle. In fact, the Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience, or STAR for short, out of Eastern Mennonite University, has adapted this model from Olga Bacharova, I believe is how you say the last name. It was published in Forgiveness and Reconciliation. So there's a book called Forgiveness and Reconciliation, and this model appears in there. And it's the cycle of violence is what they call it, breaking the cycle of violence. It looks a little like a snail shell. And so you've got these two like trauma and aggressor cycles here that we just keep circling in or doing a little figure eight in. And in order to get out of that, we have to acknowledge what's happened to us. And that means mourning, it means grieving, it means naming and confronting the fears that we now have. Sometimes it means memorializing, somehow having that memorialization. We see that with the Holocaust. The reason that the internment camps still exist is because we're memorializing that harm that happened. And then we go into reflecting on the root causes or acknowledging the story of the person who has caused us harm, and then going into reconnecting. So learning how to take risks again, learning how to practice tolerance and coexistence, engaging possibly with the person who has caused us harm, having those conversations and those questions. There's a lot of times when harms happen to us, we have a lot of questions that nobody can really answer except the person who has caused us harm. Some simple, quick analogy: my house was robbed. Were they stalking my house? Were they watching me? Was I a random target? Are my neighbors at risk? All of those are just basic questions that nobody can answer except an offender or the person who's caused us harm. And then we start moving into establishing what we define as justice, which is really an ambiguous term. Who defines justice? And that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But what does that mean for us? What makes us feel like justice has been served? And that's where it gets at what are our needs and how do we meet those needs? And once we can do that, then we can truly start integrating the trauma into our identity, into who we are, and into our story. So it's no longer this overarching, I am the victim of a crime. It's just a piece of something that's happened to me in my life. And I'm able to allow the rest of my story to come forward of who I am.
Yeah, and you were talking about the different kinds of cycles, and that's something we definitely see in the Tempest as well. We have one cycle with Prospero, who hasn't done wrong to him and then does wrong to others. But then there's one of the people that he does wrong to, which is Caliban. And at the beginning of the play, well, not the beginning, but in Caliban's story, it used to be just him and his mom on this island, and they ruled the whole island. And then his mother dies. Prospero shows up. Suddenly now Prospero's in control. Things start going well, but then Caliban acts out and there's an attempted rape. Prospero punishes him for that, and then it just keeps perpetuating. Now Caliban is just, how can I get revenge? How can I take care of him? So one of the other themes of Tempest is the question of punishment versus reconciliation, and we kind of wonder throughout the plays, like, what, because Prospero ends up bringing the people who have done him most wrong to his island, and we spend the play trying to figure out, what's he is he brought them here to try to move forward, or has he just brought them here to punish them? And it seems like he's leaning towards revenge until the very end. At one point he says, all my enemies are now here, and I'm able to do what I need to do to them. So I guess that question of those dual urges of punishment versus reconciliation, how do you each see those playing out in the work that you do?
So in the court system, which in my previous role working for the United States District Courts, you have two kinds of sentences: punitive, or rehabilitate. By nature, a punitive sentence would be life imprisonment, right? There's no possibility of parole. There's no possibility of rehabilitation. The court is acknowledging that this person should no longer have a right to walk the face of the earth. That's an entirely punitive sentence. And then there are rehabilitative sentences where an individual can go and seek treatment. And once they meet these markers, these accomplishments, these completions, then they will be reconsidered for redistribution or recirculation back in normative culture and greater society. The concept itself is rooted in the retribution versus redemption ideology of Judeo-Christian principles upon which our nation was founded. And so our system really lays down these statutes, these laws that say you are redeemable or you are not. If sentenced in that space, you truly take on the personality of that sentence, such that you begin to embody the concept of redemption or the concept of retribution. And it really speaks to the cycle that Barbie illustrated marvelously, and it speaks to the dichotomy of victimization, also the concept of justice. Justice is a very relative term when you consider that an individual that's sentenced to go to prison is paying a debt to society. They're repaying a debt to society. Well, that's an entirely abstract debt. And there's no return, aside from the tangible victim compensation fund costs, the tangible remuneration of paying back restitution, something for a physical property crime that was caused. How do you pay back a debt in which an individual's internal, social, psychological, emotional self was hurt? One could argue that that debt cannot be repaid, but the currency of that debt being repaid is a theme that's going to come up later.
Yeah, this idea of punishment versus, redemption or reconciliation really goes, I think, beyond Judeo-Christianity and goes back to Hammurabi's Code, Hammurabi's Code is from the 17th century before BC. And Hammurabi's Code says an eye for an eye. That's where we get that phrase from. An eye for an eye comes from Hammurabi's Code, which means if you do to me, I'm going to do exactly the same to you. And that's really where this idea of, I think, of punishment has its core and its roots. I'm sure it goes well before that as well. But that's a natural instinct as a human I've been harmed, and so I want you to feel my pain. And that's really the need. The need is, I hurt and I need you to feel the way I feel. And so what gets me to that point? And often in our society, that comes down to punishment for punishment's sake. But is that really my need? Do I really need you to feel my hurt and feel it at that carnal level? And what we found is that below that surface is really a need to feel heard and acknowledged and recognized that I'm in pain, that I'm hurting. And that's where an apology goes a long way. A real, authentic, genuine apology can mean loads to people. And we see that a lot right now with the sexual assault cases with the Catholic Church, that a lot of the victims in those cases, they don't want money. They consider it blood money. What they would like is an acknowledgement, a true, authentic apology, and they're not getting it. And that's that going back into that memorializing, being able to be acknowledged, acknowledging that we've been harmed. In order for us to acknowledge that my world was flipped upside down, I need someone else to acknowledge it as well. And so that's part of this trauma that we've experienced with victimization. So that idea of punishment is usually a gut instinct. That need for revenge is a gut instinct that we as humans have. If we dig deeper, though, we see that there's more to it, and we see that we are capable of recognizing the humanity in one another. There's this phrase from South Africa, Ubuntu, which has no really good English translation at all, but it basically means I am because you are. You are because I am. And it's a recognition of this shared humanity and the interconnectedness that everything we do impacts all of those around us. And so what does that mean? And so that's where with victims, we often get to identifying what their true needs are and that they need to see from this person who has caused them harm. So for instance, I had one group of victims that they really wanted to see. They felt victims. They felt like they were victims. They've been harmed severely. They were scared for their safety. They really wanted to see this person incarcerated. And we started talking about, well, what is it about incarceration that you think will benefit them, that will help them to not do this again? Do you think that when they come out, you're going to be safer? And they were like, well, no, I don't think when they come out, I'm going to be safer. So what is it that you're hoping they'll get from incarceration so that you do feel safer when they come home? And what it came down to was they felt this individual needed structure and needed guidance. And so we were able to then talk about, well, what does that structure and guidance look like if they're not incarcerated? Because in reality, they're going to have structure, but they're not going to have guidance in prison. Like, let's be real. So, and 95% of all incarcerated people come home. So what does that look like on the outside? And can we connect them with a program on the outside that provides that structure and provides that mentorship for them to help them not do this behavior again and not go back into this? And are they agreeable to it? Do they also recognize that need? And often we find people who have caused harm, they recognize that they have unmet needs. They recognize that they need help in some way, shape, or form. And so that's where we're able to then come to this agreement and this word reconciliation, which is also somewhat problematic because we might have been strangers before, so we don't really have a relationship to reconcile. But in the Tempest, they clearly do have a relationship before. So how do we reconcile that? And reconciliation doesn't necessarily mean everything goes back to the way it was before this harm happened, but it does mean that reconciliation, the alternative definition for reconciliation, is that we're able to see one another's perspective and we're able to share that perspective. We might not agree on it, but we can share it, and therefore we're considered reconciled. And so I think it is that question again of what are those needs? And people who feel like they need punishment right away, often upon reflection, being able to go through those cycles of the trauma of acting inwards and acting outwards, eventually they do get to a point where they recognize that they don't need revenge. They need something else.
So one of the reasons why The Tempest is my personal favorite Shakespeare play is because it does come down to forgiveness in the end. And at the end of the play, Prospero is brought face to face with the two people who have done him the most harm, and he forgives them both. One of them apologizes and one does not. And so, Barbie, you kind of already talking about the impact of an apology and what that can have. So I guess I would just throw it up to either one of you, what is the impact of an apology received or made, or one not received and not made? And then what might keep someone from being in a place to be able to apologize?
Speaking from my own experience. So at 17 years old, I accidentally killed my best friend in a botched robbery and would go on to serve 15 years in prison as an adult, emerging at 32 years old. So for that entire duration, the onus was on me, not the Department of Corrections, to process what had happened in my life. Because not only in that event was I the harmed party because I had lost my best friend, I was also the responsible party because I was involved in a robbery and it went wrong. And as a result, my best friend lost his life. Through that, I did immense research on forgiveness, the concept. the idea, the belief, and the feeling. And what I discovered was in this, remember the old books when the pages were so old, they would fray and turn yellow and then be like, you couldn't really turn the page of the book or else it would rip. So you had to be super ginger. Well, I had found in prison, I had found this paperback, and I didn't know what it was called. It had no cover, it had no binding, and it was about forgiveness. And in that little fragment of a book was the most profound definition of forgiveness description of forgiveness that I've ever heard. And it simply stated, forgiveness is the greatest gift that you can give to others from which you benefit yourself. And that's really the idea that Shakespeare so eloquently pits the plot against, in the sense that after forgiveness, after that admission, after I am letting go of this, one, you get the apology, two, you don't. And that conflict really comes back down to acceptance. Simply acknowledging it is beyond my catchment of control once I forgive.
Thank you for sharing so personally, Saad.
Yeah, thanks, Saad. That was great. So I often call forgiveness the F word, especially in restorative justice work. People think that that's the goal. That's what we're trying to get at, is to get people who have been harmed to forgive the person who has harmed them. And that's not the case. That's not the case at all. Forgiveness is a byproduct and can be, but it doesn't have to be. You can still have reconciliation without forgiveness. It all depends on your own personal beliefs and personal perspectives. But we call it the F word in restorative justice often, and I especially do, because of this. It is like Saad said, I love that description of forgiveness is this gift that you can give, that you benefit from. That is a gift that a victim or a person who has been harmed can give, but it is not something you should ask for. And that's where it gets tricky, is when someone I have caused someone harm, I want so much for them to forgive me, but how dare I ask them for that because I've already taken so much from them. And that's where that topic can become very tricky. In how do you handle that? How do you talk about that in these processes of having conversation, of trying to work through what are our needs? And so as someone who's caused harm, I might feel I need forgiveness, but as a person who's been harmed, I might not feel like I need to give it to you. I might be like, I'm good with just letting go. I don't think I need to verbally say I forgive you. I'm doing that in my own way, in my own time, as well as I feel like forgiveness can often be a journey, because we are in that cycle of acknowledging what's happened to us and reconnecting with the world and breaking free from this cycle. But that cycle often isn't linear. And so, as a victim of violent crime, I often will go back and I'll have great days, and then all of the something triggers my PTSD, and I'm right back in that moment. And I'm angry. I'm angry at the person who has caused me harm, even though I might have forgiven them years ago. So it is this cyclical thing that's not always linear that we have to be careful with. And that's the thing with the apology, is you can give or not give an apology and receive or not receive forgiveness in the same token. So, but the impact of an apology is huge, because that at the core of being traumatized is, Judith Herman puts this eloquently in her book, Trauma and Recovery. The core of victimization is disconnection and disengagement from others. So if we're thinking about disconnection and disengagement from others, and so as someone who's been harmed, I've been disconnected and disengaged from my norm and from those people that I am used to connecting with. As someone who's caused harm, I'm also disconnected and disempowered in that. And so when we're looking at that, that apology is really that acknowledgement that yes, this happened, and I'm sorry it happened to you. And even an apology from someone who didn't directly harm you can have a huge impact on someone who's been harmed. And we see that now as our country is in this tense race relations, that, you know, I as a white person have never owned slaves. But if I offer an apology on behalf of people of my race, that, you know, I have benefited from the oppression of other people, and I am sorry for that. That has a big impact on folks. Not everyone the same, but it does have an impact. And so an apology is huge. And again, it goes back to that acknowledgement, that need for acknowledgement that I have been harmed and I need someone to recognize my world is upside down.
Well, there's one other F word in the Tempest, and I think this will be our last question, and that other F word is freedom. The word freedom or free or freely is used so much in the Tempest. It's all over the play, and I think so much of the play, the Tempest, is concerned with this fact of how does one find freedom. So I would guess the last question would be. And it's a huge question. You know, what is the best way to move towards freedom when you have been wronged? And what is the best way to move towards freedom when you have done a wrong? Just a small final question there.
Small final question, yeah. Firstly, I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a best way. I think that there are many ways to achieve freedom. Freedom from what exactly comes back to that first identification, that self-knowledge of identifying what you are seeking to be free from. If you're in prison, obviously your first line of business is to be free of the bars and chains that physically imprison you. Though you hear often, I may be physically incarcerated, but I'm spiritually free. Freedom can be accomplished through a variety of mediums, those spirituality, emotional, analytical, educational, just so many different spaces. In context, I think freedom can be best achieved when recognizing your catchment of control. And you couple that catchment, that collective control or individual control, personal control, with acknowledging your role, your responsibility, and your ability to be accountable, and your willingness to be responsible. So through those acknowledgments, through those identifications, you come to a place where you're no longer burdened or encumbered by the chains that come with the shame, the victimization, the harm, the anger, the vicious cycles that self-harm or external harm become the outcome of. And you find yourself in a position of surrendering your will, which in many faith traditions and in many recovery models and in many transitional programs, frameworks, surrendering is key, because maybe counterintuitive to feel like when I surrender control, I actually gain power. But indeed, in the self and in the soul language of empathy, forgiveness, and sensitivity to acknowledging what others are simply feeling, letting go, surrendering, makes you feel more empowered and vis-a-vis free.
Yeah, I think Saad said it amazingly well. I mean, freedom from what is the ultimate question. What are we trying to get free from? Like, Prospero's on an island. Is he trying to get free from the island? Are we trying to get free from other people's control of us? Are we trying to get free. I know working with sexual abuse survivors, there is this sense that I am never going to be free from the consequences of what happened to me, because it has completely altered my life. And often people who have experienced severe trauma, we have physical responses to that in our bodies. There's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score about how our nervous system is impacted, our digestive systems are impacted. So you have people who have experienced severe crime, who have these long-term health consequences that is now being related to the trauma that they've experienced. And how do you get free from that? It is this re-traumatizing experience of, I'm experiencing this because of my trauma. And so it's just reminding me that this happened to me. How do I break free from that? And I think Saad said it best, and it goes back to that acknowledgement that this happened to me. I had no control over that. I had no power in that situation to be able to change that, but I have a choice and power and control now in how I move forward. And what am I going to do with moving forward? And sometimes that means allowing myself that space to be upset, to grieve, and to mourn, and to go back to that beginning of that cycle of reconnection and acknowledgement, and just grieve and mourn that I'm not going to experience certain things ever again because of the trauma that's happened to me. And allowing us to have that time in that moment, giving ourselves that space, but then also saying that I don't have to stay here. I have the choice to move through this grief. I have the choice to get up tomorrow morning and do something different. But if I'm still in the grief, that's okay too. And so it's really about going back to that acknowledgement and that choice, recognizing that we have acknowledge what's going on with us, and then choosing to have that mindset or that attitude or that actions that actually work towards that freedom that we're seeking in whatever way, whether it's be physical, spiritual, emotional freedom.
I think I didn't prep you with this final question, but I want to just end with Shakespeare and just ask you a response to a piece of text. And because it's been fascinating to hear you talk about that this giving up of control is so much of what goes into this, because that's ultimately what Prospero does. I mean, he's become this all-powerful magician. And at the end of the play, he gives up that power and re-enters society with other human beings without that power. He does decide to free Ariel. He ultimately gives the island back to Caliban. But at the end of the play, he's just left alone with the audience, and he has not found that freedom yet. And he ends with this epilogue. And I just thought, if you indulge me, I'm just going to read the epilogue and then just ask each of you what you hear in that, and how it reflects with your work. So he says, "Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strengths I have's mine own, which is most faint. Now 'tis true I must be here confined by you, or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell. But release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours, my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free." So what resonates to that in you with the work that you each do?
It speaks to the idea of second chances, turning a new page, starting over. It also speaks to what Barbie just explained so well, and that is, it simply is. Sometimes you have to acknowledge in life that it simply is, and make space for that acknowledgement and remove the shoulds or the coulds from that connotation. When you let go of what you're holding on to so dearly, you identify your abilities and your inabilities, your assets, your deficits. as a human being, we're all very frail. We're all very broken. We're all seeking our healing from a variety of different sources. However, the bottom line reality comes back into the acknowledgement that once an individual learns to let go, that sense of peace, that sense of serenity, that sense of acknowledgement empowers you to move on and turn a new page. And we see that every day with men and women as they're transitioning home from recovery, from addiction, from substance use disorder, from trauma, victims, survivors, and men and women that have been incarcerated.
Yeah, I think for me, I just, that epilogue at the end is so much this man who's searching for meaning and trying to make meaning out of what he's done, out of the experiences that he's just had, and where do you go from here? That's the question that I hear in that epilogue of where do I go from here? And he's really, I feel like he's wrestling with that choice of, you know, we were just talking about choice. What do you do with that? You have a choice on how you proceed and how you keep going forward. And he's trying to figure out what he wants to do with that. Is he ready to break free from some of these cycles? Is he ready to break free from being the oppressed who became the oppressor? Is he ready to break free from this bondage of feeling like he has been harmed and he's no longer, and he's powerless? Can he, as Saad said, can he let go of that? And step into this new normal of who he is, given everything he's experienced. And that's a lot of what I feel the work that I do is, with the victim offender conferencing here at the Delaware Center for Justice, and with restorative justice as a macro idea and concept here in the Western world, is really, it's all about making meaning out of what happens to us and figuring out how do we move forward together where all of our needs are met and we can all thrive.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm even more mad now that we have to wait another year to do the Tempest, because there's so much that you've shared that I would just immediately put to use in the rehearsal room. And I think our audience would see the play totally differently just by listening to this. So we'll probably replay this next summer as well, so we can get it in people's minds. But I just want to thank you again both so much. Again, Barbie Fischer is with Delaware Center for Justice. Saad Soliman is with Peers Mentoring Center, run by Piece by Piece. Both are incredible organizations who could use your support. So you can Google them, find them, and look for ways to support both of those organizations. We have one more event in our mostly virtual festival this Sunday, with our last Family Sunday, and we have our in-person event tomorrow night, August 1st, but that is sold out, so you can't join us for that. But we so hope you enjoyed this panel today. And again, thank you so much, Barbie, and thank you, Saad, for joining us today.
Thank you.